Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Radical Compliance podcast. I'm Matt Kelly, editor of Radical Compliance, and today we're going to talk about a new type of role emerging in the second line of defense, that of the Chief Data Officer. The CDO is somebody who, in theory, would sit alongside the Chief Compliance or Chief Risk Officer, the Chief Information Security Officer, all those executives who play some part in risk management at your organization. The chief data officer would oversee something like information risk or reporting risk data to regulators or ensuring the uniformity of data that does get generated and collected and reported out. Now, chief data officers are still mostly confined to large financial firms, and even there, the CDO is still a relatively rare position. But it's not as if information risk and the management of information risk, these things are not going to recede anytime soon. So today I wanted to take a closer look at what the chief data officer actually does and how his or her role relates to modern risk and compliance programs. To that end, then, joining me are Dan Solo and Christopher Kelly, who is no relation to me. But Dan Solo, Christopher Kelly, they are president and director, respectively, of Second Line Advisors. That is an executive search firm. And Dan and Chris just published a paper about chief data officers. So, guys, welcome to the program.
Hello. Thanks for having us. Thank you.
All right. So, my first question. The paper says that the role of the chief data officer is still relatively new, it's rare and evolving. How so? How is this a second line of defense function that, like I said, does sit along risk and compliance officers? Is that the right way to see it, or is it something different, or what's going on here? I'll throw that question out to either Dan or Chris, whichever one of you want to take point. But what do you think?
I'll take that, Matt. Thank you very much for having us today. The CDO, Chief Data Officer mandates, really emerged out of the financial crisis. So, roughly a decade ago, the crisis essentially exposed, many gaps within financial organizations' risk data aggregation and reporting frameworks. So a lot of the institutions needed someone to really kind of cull all that information and provide it to, executive management to alleviate any fines or, bad press in the market. So it's 10 years old. It's still evolving. We're in the early innings of the function. And it, initially designed with a defensive posture to mitigate the risk, to satisfy, a number of new regulatory reporting requirements coming out of the financial crisis. So in our research, we looked at a number of the top holding companies with total assets of roughly 100 billion to 2.5 trillion. And what we saw was, no one company has it truly defined of, what the data function is for them. What everyone's doing is dependent on their business strategy. So, if it's risk related, if the regulators have a spotlight on the firm, they're going to be, really focused in the compliance and risk function. So our research showed that there is no reporting line directly into a chief compliance officer.
Yeah.
Out of the top institutions that we looked at, and we did a deeper dive into the reporting structures, we found that 21% of data officers report into a chief risk officer.
Okay.
So again, focusing in on that defensive posture.
And if I can just add to that, Matt, this is Dan.
Sure.
The CCAR obligations and requirements for these large bank organizations really were the impetus for culling together data from a reporting standpoint. And of course, the regulatory attention on matters such as anti-money laundering and the KYC elements and really getting things right. So the main piece of what created the CDO function was really instilling a strong sense of governance into these organizations, which was a key aspect which was missing. And it took a little bit of time for there to be an overall chief data officer in name for a company, but there were these pockets of data executives or data management people that were sitting either in the lines of business or within a function to help influence and lead in certain ways and get the stakeholders to understand why things need to be done that way. But over the last 5 years, and even within the last 3, I would say 2 or 3, the CDO function has become more of a real, 3-letter title in the sense that has given it more visibility and has bubbled up from the lines of business to someone being at a corporate or enterprise level to look across the organization and really pull it all up together. So the governance piece has really been is really where it all sort of started.
Yeah. So let me ask another question. You mentioned that in your study that you did, you looked at very large banks and trying to find out how many of them do have chief data officers or not. Did they all have CDOs or some CDO position, whether it was open or not? I don't know. But I mean, is this a fairly universal phenomena at large financial firms now?
No, actually it's not. Again, it goes back to my point where it depends on the nature of the firm and where the business priorities lie. Out of 37 of firms that we've looked at, we identified 31 that do have a designated chief data officer within the United States. 3 out of the top 10 institutions do not have a designated CDO at the enterprise level. They function more as kind of a federated model across platforms or at the heads of business.
Yep.
So again, it goes to the fact that no one has a set kind of strategy as it relates to reporting structure there.
Yeah, it's much further along than where it was, say, 2-3 years ago, where organizations are now at a point where elevating someone to a C-suite reporting line makes a lot of sense, and I think the regulators appreciate that. But when you bring into account all the different tentacles of where, managing the data, the obligation of managing the data, how it's held, how it's reported, and where it goes, and all of the vendors that are now in the mix, it's become evident that that's a role that CROs and their designated direct reports and chief compliance officers and the heads of BSA AML are all sort of triangulating with these data executives to try and get things done appropriately. In today's sort of modernized, sort of technology and risk orientation, data is really all that firms are looking at and trying to streamline and improve upon how they deal with it all. But it seems like the most important thing from the standpoint of the compliance side is really making sure that the data comes in correctly.
Yeah.
That sort of brings it all back to the beginning of how it's captured appropriately. And using the AML example, names, just simply names could be misspelled or have an extra space at the end or a letter that may, change the whole concept of who that customer is. So the KYC element, as an example, really falls into a classic way of how a data executive will be influential as to how they can get their KYC aligned and the tools in which they use to do that from an assessment standpoint.
So you guys had mentioned that something like 20 or 21% of data officers report into a chief risk officer. Okay, but do you have any sense of where do chief data officers come from? Are they IT people who move into data governance, or are there other skill sets that people could drift into this?
So, I'd say that there are a couple of different models for the CDO, and it has a lot to do with the evolution of the function. You'd see many folks that have been in a data management function come from more the technology background, which we would say is not necessarily the future model. But for organizations that are maybe in version 2 of a chief data officer, we've found that a bulk of them are really in this profile, what we're categorizing as operations and strategy, where there are folks that have a good operational understanding of how an organization works, maybe have worked in different parts of the organization as a business leader of sort or a COO, and many of them have had experience in management consulting or training in a management consulting or advisory firm, such as a McKinsey, BCG type of organization.
Yep.
And so we've recognized that as being really the reality of where a number of these CDOs are today, and makes a lot of sense when you look at what the future of the function could be, and how a chief data officer can really help to move the needle on business as opposed to just on regulation.
Okay, so talk to us a little more then about where the future of this role might go, because on one hand, banks are highly regulated. On the other, we have deregulation is the word out of everybody's mouth in Washington right now. There's cost cutting that I think a lot of banks would love to manage their IT spending a little more, I'll call it closely. So what's really going to go on with this function, and how does it become sort of a viable thing over the future?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a new 4-letter word in financial services. It's called GDPR.
Oh, yeah.
And this wonderful GDPR requirement and obligation through the EU has really, added another layer of attention and, really an extra job on everyone's plate for the next several months to meet with the obligation for April of next year. So, between GDPR and really many places still building a strong governance function, it's going to take at least another, I would say, 2 to 5 years to really be able for a CDO to really move the needle and evolve in its function.
Yep.
And it'll probably have a quicker success at, the lower tier of these large banks, call it a regional bank. That may not be as complicated as, the trillion-dollar banks. They may not be as global. They may not have as many lines of business or, become who they are based upon so many different acquisitions in different ways. So they'll have probably an easier road to an evolutionary chief data officer than would someone of, the large bank that has, really has a bombardment of regulatory obligations and has more systems and tools than one can ever imagine. But, the GDPR piece is really a huge attention item, has so much hair on it that a lot of attention is really geared towards that in the short term. But we foresee that the CDO function in financial services will soon look like what CDO function is with some industries outside of financial services where the chief data officer role already exists. I'd say out in front in that is really, you can look at some of the credit bureaus and how much their whole business model is based on data.
Yep.
Many of the credit card related companies, whether it be processors or financial services elements that have been involved in credit card, are very out in front as it relates to the data function. The medical and health field is also, there's lots of regulation and usage by that industry in various ways, which to a degree has much to do with GDPR as well. But you look at the major technology companies out there, from the Facebook, Google, Amazon. There's certainly a significant attention on utilizing data, as we all know. But the regulators are obviously getting smart as it relates to this. They have chief data officers at the CFPB, at the Federal Reserve, for the different banks, at the board level. So it's not necessarily all on the banking area to get up to speed, but certainly there's definitely lots of room to grow for financial services and really moving the needle from the standpoint of how to use this as a business enabling type of function.
Okay. And you touched on what was going to be one of my last questions there for compliance officers listening who really aren't in banking or financial services at all. Is this something that they're going to see more of, whether it's an actual chief data officer title, or I think there probably are data management people at most organizations, but I'm just still trying to get a sense of how widespread this job might become over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, the data science and data analytics piece is very evident in pretty much all industry that has anything to do with commerce, modern day commerce.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you have listeners that are in the industrial side or on the pharma side, I'd be very surprised if they're not aware of a data scientist or data analytics function that exists. Maybe it's more in a defensive posture, as Chris had mentioned, but it's certainly realistic as to how an organization is viewing their customer base and the strategy around marketing to, utilizing, and cross-pollinating their business going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think from a compliance standpoint, it's advantageous for chief compliance officers in any industry to become very close to and familiar with the data function, because that's really how the compliance and regulatory function is evolving, and we all need to be very savvy when it comes to technology, which is, I think, a given in today's day and age. But the term 5-10 years ago, big data and all of that is really coming down to the nuts and bolts of how we're all doing work today. And I think it's important for CCOs to get smart as it relates to data management and the analytics and tools behind it, because it's not so far in the future any longer. It's really part of modern day interactions and obligations by organizations.
All right. Well, guys, that's all the time we have today, but Dan Solo and Christopher Kelly, you gave us plenty of information to think about here, so thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.
All right. And again, everybody, that was Dan Solo and Christopher Kelly of Second Line Advisors, and they were here talking to me today about chief data officers and the role that these CDOs might be playing in risk management in the future. You can find a link to the paper that they put out. That will be in the show notes for this podcast if you want to download it and give it a read. And that is all for our podcast today. So I'm Matt Kelly, editor of Radical Compliance. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time.